No Witchcraft for Sale by Doris Lessing. The Farquhars had been childless for years when little Teddy was born, and they were touched by the pleasure of their servants who brought presents of fowls and eggs and flowers to the homestead when they came to rejoice over the baby, exclaiming with delight over his downy golden head and his blue eyes. They congratulated Mrs. Farquhar as if she had achieved a very great thing, and she felt that she had. Her smile for the lingering, admiring natives was warm and grateful. Later, when Teddy had his first haircut, Gideon, the cook, picked up the soft gold tufts from the ground and held them reverently in his hand. Then he smiled at the little boy and said, "Little Yellowhead." That became the native name for the child. Gideon and Teddy were great friends from the first. When Gideon had finished his work, he would lift Teddy on his shoulders to the shade of a big tree and play with him there, forming curious little toys from twigs and leaves and grass, or shaping animals from wetted soil. When Teddy learned to walk, it was often Gideon who crouched before him, clucking encouragement, finally catching him when he fell, tossing him up in the air till they both became breathless with laughter. Mrs. Farquhar was fond of the old cook because of his love for her child. There was no second baby, and one day Gideon said, "Ah, Missus, the Lord above sent this one. Little Yellowhead is the most good thing we have in our house." Because of that, Mrs. Farquhar felt a warm impulse toward her cook, and at the end of the month she raised his wages. He had been with her now for several years. He was one of the few natives who had his wife and children in the compound and never wanted to go home to his kraal, which was some hundreds of miles away. Sometimes a small pickaninny who had been born the same time as Teddy could be seen peering from the edge of the bush, staring in awe at the little white boy with his miraculous fair hair and northern blue eyes. The two little children would gaze at each other with a wide, interested gaze, and once Teddy put out his hand curiously to touch the black child's cheeks and hair. Gideon, who was watching, shook his head wonderingly and said, "Ah, Missus, these are both children, and one will grow up to be a boss, and one will be a servant." And Mrs. Farquhar smiled and said sadly, "Yes, Gideon, I was thinking the same." She sighed. "It is God's will," said Gideon, who was a mission boy. The Farquhars were very religious people, and this shared feeling about God bound servant and masters even closer together. Teddy was about 6 years old when he was given a scooter and discovered the intoxications of speed. All day he would fly around the homestead, in and out of flower beds, scattering squawking chickens and irritated dogs, finishing with a wide, dizzying arc into the kitchen door. There he would cry, "Gideon, look at me!" And Gideon would laugh and say, "Very clever, little Yellowhead." Gideon's youngest son, who was now a herds boy, came especially up from the compound to see the scooter. He was afraid to come near it, but Teddy showed off in front of him. "Pickaninny," shouted Teddy, "get out of my way!" And he raced in circles around the black child until he was frightened and fled back to the bush. "Why did you frighten him?" asked Gideon, gravely reproachful. Teddy said defiantly, "He's only a black boy," and laughed. Then, when Gideon turned away from him without speaking, his face fell. Very soon he slipped into the house and found an orange and brought it to Gideon, saying, "This is for you." He could not bring himself to say he was sorry, but he could not bear to lose Gideon's affection either. Gideon took the orange unwillingly and sighed. "Soon you will be going away to school, little Yellowhead," he said wonderingly. "And then you will be grown up." He shook his head gently and said, "And that is how our lives go." He seemed to be putting a distance between himself and Teddy, not because of resentment, but in the way a person accepts something inevitable. The baby had lain in his arms and smiled up into his face. The tiny boy had swung from his shoulders and played with him by the hour. Now Gideon would not let his flesh touch the flesh of the white child. He was kind, but there was a grave formality in his voice that made Teddy pout and sulk away. Also, it made him into a man. With Gideon he was polite, and carried himself formally, and if he came into the kitchen to ask for something, it was in the way a white man uses toward a servant, expecting to be obeyed. But on that day that Teddy came staggering into the kitchen with his fist to his eyes, shrieking with pain, Gideon dropped the pot full of hot soup that he was holding, rushed to the child, and forced aside his fingers. "A snake!" he exclaimed. Teddy had been on his scooter and had come to a rest with his foot on the side of a big tub of plants. A tree snake, hanging by its tail from the roof, had spat full into his eyes. Mrs. Farquhar came running when she heard the commotion. "He'll go blind," she sobbed, holding Teddy close against her. "Gideon, he'll go blind." Already the eyes, with perhaps half an hour's sight left in them, were swollen up the size of fists. Teddy's small white face was distorted by great purple oozing protuberances. Gideon said, "Wait a minute, missus. I'll get some medicine." He ran off into the bush. Mrs. Farquhar lifted the child into the house and bathed his eyes with permanganate. She had scarcely heard Gideon's words, but when she saw that her remedies had no effect at all, and remembered how she had seen natives with no sight in their eyes because of the spitting of a snake, she began to look for the return of her cook, remembering what she heard of the efficacy of native herbs. She stood by the window, holding the terrified, sobbing little boy in her arms, and peered helplessly into the bush. It was not more than a few minutes before she saw Gideon come bounding back, and in his hand he held a plant. "Do not be afraid, missus," said Gideon. "This will cure little Yellowhead's eyes." He stripped the leaves from the plant, leaving a small, white, fleshy root. Without even washing it, he put the root in his mouth, chewed it vigorously, and then held the spittle there while he took the child forcibly from Mrs. Farquhar. He gripped Teddy down between his knees and pressed the balls of his thumbs into the swollen eyes so that the child screamed, and Mrs. Farquhar cried out in protest, "Gideon, Gideon!" But Gideon took no notice. He knelt over the writhing child, pushing back the puffy lids till chinks of eyeballs showed, and then he spat hard, again and again, into first one eye and then the other. He finally lifted Teddy gently into his mother's arms and said, "His eyes will get better." But Mrs. Farquhar was weeping with terror, and she could hardly thank him. It was impossible to believe that Teddy could keep his sight. In a couple of hours the swellings were gone. The eyes were inflamed and tender, but Teddy could see. Mr. and Mrs. Farquhar went to Gideon in the kitchen and thanked him over and over again. They felt helpless because of their gratitude. It seemed they could do nothing to express it. They gave Gideon presents for his wife and children and a big increase in wages, but these things could not pay for Teddy's now completely cured eyes. Mrs. Farquhar said, "Gideon, God chose you as an instrument for his goodness." And Gideon said, "Yes, missus, God is very good." Now, when such a thing happens on a farm, it cannot be long before everyone hears of it. Mr. and Mrs. Farquhar told their neighbors, and the story was discussed from one end of the district to the other. The bush is full of secrets. No one can live in Africa, or at least on the veldt, without learning very soon that there is an ancient wisdom of leaf and soil and season, and too, perhaps most important of all, of the darker tracks of the human mind, which is the black man's heritage. Up and down the district people were telling anecdotes, reminding each other of things that had happened to them. "But I saw it myself, I tell you. It was a puff-adder bite. The Kafir's arm was swollen to the elbow like a great shiny black bladder. He was groggy. After half a minute he was dying. Then suddenly a Kafir walked out of the bush with his hands full of green stuff. He smeared something on the place, and next day my boy was back at work, and all you could see was 2 small punctures in the skin." This was the kind of tale they told,